Okay, why don't we get started? It's my tremendous pleasure to introduce the speaker for the last event of the China in the World program for this year. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And we're really pleased to have Yun Sun, who is the senior fellow and co-director on China and East Asia at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. She is an expert on China's foreign relations with the United States, with its neighbors, and with other authoritarian regimes. She's worked at the Brookings Institution in their foreign policy program and global development program. She worked at the International Crisis Group based in Beijing from 2008 to 2011. She has a master's degree in international policy and practice from George Washington University, Elliott School, right? Elliott School, and a BA and an MA from the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing, China. And she told me today that in a week, she will be marching for her PhD at Johns Hopkins SAIS and will be hooded as Dr. Sun.
Thank you.
And she wrote a really good article that caught my attention on China's Trump strategy, and that's what she's here to present today. And this is unusual for China in the world. This is no restrictions. It's recorded. It's open. So just know that we're being recorded, and it's an open discussion. So there you go. Because
Okay.
we used to use Chatham House. So.
Oh, now I'm scared. Oh,
No,
okay.
no, you shouldn't be scared. Don't be scared. And we had the pleasure of traveling to Taiwan and to Xiamen together in 2019, right?
I always learn a lot from.
Oh,
Thank you so much,
yeah.
sir. No, seriously. And please don't call me Dr. Sun. When you say Dr. Sun, that's founding father of China.
That's
That's
not a bad thing. Everyone loves him. Everyone from all spectrum love that guy, right?
Yes,
Because
he
he
did.
died young, like Jim Morrison.
He did. And now the permanent head damage is almost over. We'll see if I can still speak coherently. So thank you. I understand that you all have finals coming up. So thank you for taking the time to have a change of focus or change of mood for 90 minutes. I also understand there will be dinner by the end of the session. So please stay for the whole session. So I was asked to talk about China's Trump strategy. I published the article in, I think it was in February. So it was about 3 months old. So I think it would be interesting to provide some update from how things have evolved from there. Because now everyone's focus is on the tariff war, right? We know that 145%, 125%, 245%, however you name it, because it doesn't really matter. After 60%, trade is already killed. Whether it's 100% or 200%, it does not really make a difference other than for emotional satisfaction. But we also know that China and the United States have been in a state of tariff war since 2018, because that's when the first wave of tariff war was formally launched, and that round of tariff was never removed by the Biden administration. So technically, you could call the current wave only the second wave, but it definitely has escalated from the first round. I think there has been a conviction on the part of the White House, this current White House, from the very beginning, that if U.S. escalates the tariff on the Chinese products, China for sure will back off. China will fold. China will concede. Because I think that judgment was made based on the assessment of the Chinese economy, because the Chinese economy is not where it was 7 years ago. The economic slowdown has been having its impact on China. And remember, there was also the 3 years of COVID lockdown that China endured. So the conviction, I think the reason or the rationale that the current administration made the decision to escalate the tariff war was because they believe that China will surrender. And you have seen this from the White House, from the president, China will surrender. But then we're here. China does not surrender. China retaliate in kind. So now I think the key question for both sides is how to climb down the ladder of escalation, because I think both sides understand that this is not sustainable. if you maintain this level of tariff from both sides, there's effectively no trade between U.S. and China. And you could argue that U.S. president is subject to more pressure from the market and from the private sector to de-escalate the tariff. So there is currently in Washington, we see this this push for there to be a resolution or for there to be a de-escalation. And the most recent potential that we have heard that the Chinese interlocutors have conveyed is that China will want to start talking, but not start talking with trade issue. Chinese are willing to start talking about fentanyl, which in the Chinese view was the origin of the 2 rounds of 10% tariff added by Trump administration since January 20th anyway. So the Chinese have designated Wang Xiaohong, who is the Minister of Public Security, to be in charge of this this fentanyl negotiation. And Wang Xiaohong's nickname is Xi Jinping's dagger. So now we're seeing Xi Jinping's dagger probably will come in and save the day. We'll see how that goes because there's not yet a clear picture as for how the fentanyl negotiation will lead to the trade negotiation and whether the two leaders will be talking to each other. But I think this background really just reveals one question. How is China going to deal with the second term of Trump presidency? What is their end game? What is their goal? And how are they preparing or how have they prepared for Trump 2.0? And then first, we can look at how China has been different compared to Trump 1.0, because Trump 1.0, we saw a pretty interesting pattern. So 2017, it was Trump reaching out to China in search for cooperation on the issue of North Korea. If you remember, Trump at that point was telling the world about his button being bigger about than the North Korean leader's button on nuclear weapons. He was talking about the fire and fury. He was seeking Chinese cooperation on international sanctions, especially UN sanctions on North Korea. And 2017 indeed witnessed unprecedented Chinese cooperation to the extent of 5 UN sanction resolutions was passed on North Korea. That was 2017, but in 2018, we saw the trade war started. In 2019, the trade war evolved to the new Cold War. Basically, Trump team and a number of the cabinet members at that time declared a war on Chinese Communist Party. So it got into the realm of ideology, with ideology attack against the Chinese Communist Party. And if you work on China, you know that once you start attacking the Chinese Communist Party, the conversation is over, right? So, but interestingly, in 2019, we saw this basically the maximum pressure campaign that Trump built eventually paved the ground for the phase 1 trade deal reached in January of 2020. And now we look back on the timeline of that negotiation, it was very clearly timed to fit in the election campaign or the re-election campaign of the Trump presidency at the time. So the goal was to reach a deal in January, and the impact of that deal would be felt in the following 6 to 7 months by the American farmers, industries, and that would naturally, in Trump's view, would reflect in the
Give it to her.
Thank
I'm
you.
good though.
Thank you. Thank you. That would reflect in the eventual re-election votes. And we know that didn't happen because of the COVID issue. But without COVID, I think there was a very good chance that Trump was going to win the second term back in 2020 instead of 2024. So how is China different this time compared to last time? One thing is consistent, China retaliates. Now, when there is a U.S. tariff being imposed on Chinese products, China will retaliate in that exact same percentage on American goods. So it presents a picture of parity or an equal level of countermeasure, but in actuality, parity doesn't exist. Why? Because U.S. exports so much more to China than I'm sorry, U.S. imports so much more from China than the Chinese are importing from the United States. So when China imposes the same percentage of tariff on a much smaller amount of goods exported to China, in the end, the amount of the tariff collected is very different. So other than this consistency in terms of the percentage, but the Chinese reactions this time around, as we can observe, have several distinct differences. The first one is China is much less emotional this time. Last time you would see the whole Chinese media machine or the propaganda machine was mobilized to attack United States, to attack U.S. tariff, to call U.S. by name, and also to criticize the United States as the ultimate champion of protectionism, hegemonism, and unilateralism. But this time, the criticism on the United States is much less vocal. They still criticize. The foreign ministry spokesperson will still come out and say, this is unacceptable, this is U.S. bullying behavior. But that was pretty much the level it was capped. So it did not escalate to a leadership level calling U.S. out. The Chinese also did not mobilize all forward diplomats like they did last time. So for example, you don't see the consul general here in New York coming out to give a press conference or doing a public speaking, calling out the United States for its trade war. So this time there's also criticism, but it's much less emotional and I would say less visible compared to last time. We could try to debate why that is the case. I think the first time around, China was caught by surprise. There was very little preparation. The Chinese were thinking, hey, we were working okay on North Korea. So how come suddenly there's this tariff being imposed on us? Where did that come from? But this time around, I think because China has had that previous experience, they know that Trump will be unpredictable. They know that this will be uncertain. So I think they're better prepared emotionally. So therefore, the reaction is much less vehement compared to last time. And so far, we haven't seen the Chinese calling any U.S. cabinet members or U.S. leaders out by name, right? Last time around, they called then Secretary of State Pompeo a long list of names. They called, for example, some officials from the National Security Council out by their names. But this time, the Chinese have not mentioned anyone by name, not President Trump, not even Vice President Vance, even when he made the comments about Chinese peasants. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, when they were making a comment about that question, said, well, certain vice president has called Chinese peasants. So,
A certain vice president.
certain vice president. So it did not very deliberately try to avoid offending or taking it personal or targeting any cabinet members or U.S. officials on a personal level. And we're also seeing the Chinese reactions are much more diverse. They retaliated with their own tariff, 125%, but they are also imposing a number of export control measures on the United States. They also put a number of U.S. companies on their negative lists, which is basically a sanction list. They are saying no to Boeing airplanes, which definitely rings a bell because Boeing airplane export has been one main category of the U.S. export to China. Chinese are also targeting specific agricultural products, targeting energy products. So these are very much targeted on the base of Trump's constituency. So I would say that China, just judging from their reaction, it has a bigger toolkit, is better prepared. And I've been to China a number of times this year since Trump's inauguration. What I have observed since February is that the Chinese are so much more confident this time around. They feel that, well, if we could do this in 2018, if we could survive in 2018 without any preparation, this time we have already had 7 years to build up basically a cushion or the toolkits to react to Trump 2.0. So China's economy, the economic slowdown of Chinese economy is actually cited as an advantage of China, because Chinese economic slowdown has already absorbed a lot of the shocks on the system. And Xi Jinping's power, especially after these 3 years of COVID lockdown, is more strengthened than before. So they feel that, well, China is actually at a better place to deal with Trump 2.0. And honestly, I think the Chinese are correct when they said that the decoupling has already been under the way, right? One of Biden administration's key policy towards China is selective decoupling, is to have the one people might remember the small yard high fence, which specifically targets the high tech products or export to China. To the extent that the high-end semiconductor chips are no longer accessible for the Chinese industries. But what the Chinese have learned from that process is inferiority can also be viable, meaning that China's economy does not have to rely on semiconductor chips of 7 nanometer and below to thrive. They can have 14 nanometers in terms of semiconductor chips and they can still survive. They can still maintain the normal function of the economy. So I call it a viable inferiority, and the Chinese economy can definitely survive from that. And of course, Chinese domestically have also made a number of policy preparations for Trump 2.0. We have seen, like, for example, from the Central Economic Policy World Conference of last December, which is this annual conference by the Chinese Communist Party to determine the economic policy of the next year. So from this conference, we saw that China has promised or has basically publicized their more assertive expansionist fiscal policy, which means that there will be more government spending, more investment, and more government stimulation of the economy. There will be a more loose monetary policy, which is the first time that Chinese government have not announced a loose monetary policy since 2014. Not even during the first round of the trade war, right? So now they're saying that we're willing to release more currency into the economy in order to stimulate growth and stimulate opportunities. The Chinese are also, well, since a few years ago, preparing this notion called dual circulation, meaning domestic circulation of the economy plus on top of the international or the external circulation of economy. So basically domestic market plus international market. And that goes back to the essential question that everyone is looking at in terms of China's economic growth, that everyone is telling Beijing that you have to rely more on domestic consumptions. In order to grow your economy, you cannot just rely on pumping the rest of the world for export. That's not sustainable. You have to make your people more safe to spend. So that's what the Chinese domestic policy preparation has been looking like. So we are seeing that the Chinese government this year, they have been announcing a number of expansionist fiscal policy and monetary policy initiatives in order to put more capital and more investment into the Chinese economy domestically. And there's also the preparation externally, which is this dual circulation, but you could also say this is export of the new three, the EV, batteries, and the solar panels, which has been regarded as China's top three priority in terms of promotion of export. So one thing that Chinese have been keen on building in the past 7 years is a lot of the direct trade between US and China have become indirect.
Yeah.
Meaning that what we used to import directly from China, now it's not directly from China. Now it's from Southeast Asian countries or it's from countries like Mexico. The Chinese are investing in transshipment arrangements through these countries. And to give you just some numbers of this backdoor trade into the US market in order to evade the tariff US imposes on Chinese products. Last year, China ran an astounding trade surplus against whole world of $1 trillion US. 1 trillion against the whole rest of the world. And every single country in Southeast Asia runs a trade deficit vis-a-vis China, except Malaysia. Malaysia miraculously runs a trade surplus.
Chips.
Something else is if you look into the data, Malaysia has been the center of transshipment of Iranian oil to China.
Oh,
So
charming.
yeah, if you look at the data, it's really fascinating that in, I think, July last year, Malaysia crude oil export to China was, I think, twice the size of its domestic production. You're like, well, how does that happen? Well, CNPC gave me a very, very, very formal answer that, well, Malaysia is an international oil trading country, so they can buy other oil and sell to China,
Markets, yeah.
which is true, spy market, a shadow market. So like, for example, Vietnam last year, their Vietnamese trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States was 120 billion US dollars.
25.
Yeah. And the China, guess what? China's trade surplus vis-a-vis Vietnam was 60 billion US dollars. So we're seeing that basically the whole Southeast Asia runs a huge trade deficit vis-a-vis China, but at the same time also runs a significant trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States. And then you have to wonder that, oh, China is exporting so much to Southeast Asia. Are they really the final destination or the consumer of Chinese goods? Most likely not, because developed country markets and developing country markets absorb different types of products, right? So you don't expect the Vietnamese consumers to buy the same type of products as the American consumers would purchase. So that's why if you look at the trade number, it tells you a lot of stories. And another comparison, just to show you how ginormous the trade deficit is that last year China's trade with Vietnam was actually bigger than China's trade with Russia. And this happened against the background that China has been increasing a crude oil import from Russia significantly since and consistently since the beginning of the Ukraine war. And even China-Russia trade is growing at this fast speed. China's trade with Vietnam, such a smaller, more tinier country, still trumps China's trade with Russia. That shows you how important Southeast Asia has been in this link. So what does that mean? That means that, well, tariff really matters, but it matters only to a certain extent, right? Between US and China, US can impose a prohibitively high tariff on Chinese export, but if the Chinese export is still going through Southeast Asian countries into the US market, then unless US puts Southeast Asia in the same category, it's not going to be effectively curing the problem. Which is why that when you look at the trade wars this time around, it's not necessarily just about China, because China in the past 7 years have developed a very mature plan to use the rest of the world to export to the United States. So trade is like water. It goes to where the tariff is low. And when the tariff is high between US and China, it will naturally go to the lowland where the tariff is lower. And if US decides to punish the trading partners of China, then that could be the beginning of a real bipolarization of the global economy, right? So my observation from all this talking to Chinese interlocutors, talking to Chinese economists, is that while the Chinese are more confident this time around, they believe that they are truly implementing the de-Americanization of their foreign policy and of their trade. They're truly facing the world independent of the influence of the United States. They're dealing with the world as its own, right? And US being an interferon or being an interference factor here is no longer a constraining factor, because in the past, the Chinese foreign policy is all about the United States. It's about what US may or will not do vis-a-vis China. But now I think the Chinese answer is that, well, it doesn't matter. The great power competition eventually is about the rest of the world anyway. So if China can bind the rest of the world into China's trading system, then China will win that competition without having to deal with the United States bilaterally or directly. So that is China's plan. Sounds like a good plan. Are there any problems with their plan? There are definitely problems with that plan, which is also weirdly almost entirely mute in both Chinese and American media. So if you read Chinese media and American media, one thing that is shared, is common, that both sides are very concerned or very critical of negative impact on the US economy, but there's almost zero reference to the negative impact on the Chinese economy. But if you look at the numbers, if U.S.-China trade, the bilateral trade is eliminated, that will translate into at least 3 to 5% of the Chinese GDP. China had planned for the GDP growth for 2025 to be at 5%. So if we cannot resolve this trade war and the tariff basically effectively kills bilateral trade, then China's dreamed or planned the GDP growth this year is no more. And you can also see the impact of the trade war on Chinese domestic employment. Like in Beijing, this is not a scientific criteria, but the traffic in Beijing is so much better because there are less people in Beijing, because there are less jobs in Beijing, and there are buildings and buildings of office buildings are empty. So you could wonder that what does this trade war really means for the Chinese export industry. And also remember, when the economy is bad and the outlook for the future economy is negative, people don't spend their money. So this idea that China will resort to domestic consumption to deal with a trade war, I think that's a fantasy. Because when people are faced with economic uncertainties, they will save money, especially Chinese people.
Yeah.
They will save a lot of money.
It's not really true of Americans.
It's not necessarily true with Americans, but Chinese definitely save money. So this idea that domestic consumption will fill the void, I think that's really a fantasy. But then, of course, if you talk to Chinese officials, there are two responses. The first one is, well, our people's pain tolerance is extremely high. So even if they're jobless, even if they're unemployed, it does not necessarily mean there's going to be a social instability that will disrupt the political stability. And the second reaction is that we, China, have a trade-in plan that's sponsored by the Chinese government. And you might have heard this story about the Mr. Washing Machine. So there's a senior economic policy maker in the Chinese government, and I think among China observers, his nickname that's Mr. Washing Machine. The reason is that every time he's being challenged about the Chinese domestic consumption not being vigorous enough to fill in the void, his answer is, do you know how many people we have in China? What is the Chinese population? 1.4 billion. Do you know how many washing machines they use? Millions of washing machines. And just imagine if we mobilize this Chinese population to upgrade or to buy new washing machines, how many washing machines is that? So one of the proposals, actually not proposals, policies that we have seen Beijing implementing is this trade-in plan to trade your old appliances in for new appliances. So this is a government mobilized campaign to stimulate domestic consumption. So it could work because the Chinese do have a very large domestic market, but eventually when we talk about economic growth, it comes from three things, right? Pretty much only three things: trade, export, investment, and consumption. We're not looking at a hugely positive consumption outlook for Chinese market. And the trade, we're looking at China taking a significant trauma because of the trade war with the United States. And then that leaves investment. The external, well, foreign direct investment in China have been severely undermined in the past few years because Chinese government has been emphasizing national security. Remember, there have been a number of cases of U.S. companies and European companies, including Japanese companies, being under investigation because they triggered the national security concern of the Chinese government. So foreign investors have their confidence have been shaken, and that pretty much just leaves domestic investment by whom? By the Chinese government. That's a fiscal policy, expansionist fiscal policy, and the loose monetary policy. So I wouldn't say that the Chinese economy is looking at a very positive picture for the foreseeable future, but they are more resilient. That's well, I wouldn't say the beauty, but that's a distinct feature of a system that is not democratic, that does not have election every 4 years. So the leaders definitely has more bandwidth and has more instrument to deal with, to absorb the shock from a trade war. This is some observers have called this a game of chicken, basically looking at President Trump and President Xi, who is going to back off first. To me, this is more of a war of attrition. You're looking at a prolonged escalation or prolonged tariff war, and how long, which country or which great power, which country will last longer before they blink depends on their domestic political capital, depends on their own domestic economic resilience. So in this particular case, I don't necessarily see that U.S. as holding the upper hand, simply because the Chinese has a very different system, both politically and economically. What is China's priority? We're looking at China trying, well, if you look at the trade number from last year, China has been pumping the rest of the world for export, right? And now when the US market is essentially closed, I think China's first instinct is that, well, then we need to look at the rest of the world. The European market, the markets in global south, I think that really presents a very difficult question for Beijing, that which one do you prioritize? Do you prioritize your domestic needs to promote export and then suppress the rest of the world of their own market? Or do you try to balance the relationship between the domestic need for economic growth and also the external need for a stable relationship with the rest of the world? Because last year, we also saw an unprecedented number of WTO lawsuits from global South countries against China.
Mhm.
That's how much China had been pushing for what some would say dumping of the Chinese products in these countries. And leadership is about doing the right thing, not doing the right thing for yourself, right? In each corner, well, we see that China has always prioritized its own selfish need, maybe with the exception of the 1997, the Asian financial crisis, where China did keep the value of the Chinese currency stable. But I think now we're at a critical juncture that what will China choose to do now that the trade war is not de-escalating? That are you going to push the rest of the world for export, or you're going to pursue a more balanced approach? So the eventual result that we're looking at is, I think by the end of this, well, first, I don't think the trade war is going to completely go away between US and China. We're looking at a difficult process of rebalancing US-China economic relations. There are two ways to correct a deficit or to remedy a deficit. You can increase your export, or you can decrease the other side's import, right? Export to your market. But to increase export to Chinese market at this point, I would say it's very difficult for the United States. And which is why the phase one trade deal is not going to be the solution this time around. Why? First off, what we are willing to export to China is very limited. We're willing to export energy products, and the estimate is the most, given the current infrastructure constraint, the most US can export to China in terms of oil and gas is somewhere around 50 to 60 billion US dollars. So about 16% of the current trade deficits that we run with China. And this is primarily because energy trade is heavily dependent on infrastructure. If you don't have the pipeline, if you don't have the port, if you don't have the containers, the oil tank, the tanks, you can't really export energy to another country, which is why that shifting the energy relationship between Russia and Europe has been so difficult, because the infrastructure is there. So energy is limited. We're looking at 15 to 16%. US is willing to export agricultural products to China. So that's soybeans, the famous soybeans. And 75% of China's international imported soybean currently comes from Brazil. So arguably, there is a space there that China could use some of the import of soybeans from Brazil and ship that to the US market. But for trade experts, soybean is not going to solve trade deficit.
A lot of soybeans.
It will be a lot of soybeans. So if you are trying to address trade deficit, soybean is not going to be the answer. Not corn, not sorghum, not wheat. So that's just not significant. Or lobsters. So that's very unlikely. And originally, I think there were some hopes that maybe Boeing can export more planes to China. But we have a problem, which is Boeing's capacity is maxed out by 2030.
Yeah, they have orders.
They have orders that are so backed up.
So the infrastructure
is also limited. Yeah. So Boeing will not be able to export or make any single airplane to export to China before 2030, which means that next election is 2028. So that's not going to help President Trump. So that pretty much leaves the most effective option to address the trade deficit is high-tech products.
NVIDIA.
Yes, the GPUs, the CPUs, the semiconductor chips. So those are the high-end, high-value products.
We could sell weapons.
To whom?
To China.
So we're but we're not willing to sell high tech products to China at this point, which means to increase our export to China is extremely difficult. That leaves the option to decrease the Chinese export to the U.S. market, which in a way is what the tariff is doing, and what eventually will be, I believe, the most effective way to address the trade deficit. But it's not really just addressing trade deficit; it's killing the trade, right?
Yeah.
We are aiming with a trade war. We're aiming to, well, we're not exporting more to China, and the Chinese are exporting less to us, and the trade at the current level is effectively dead. So we would definitely look at a more balanced U.S. China trade by the end of this.
Balanced meaning nothing happens.
Yeah.
It's extremely balanced.
And that's
It's like U.S. North Korea trade. It's very balanced.
there's no trade. So there will be significantly less trade between the two countries. Whether that is good news, I think that's subject to debate. So I think I'll stop there. I can talk more about Trump's China strategy if you're interested. Just happy to have a discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So one of the nice things about being the director of the program is I get to ask the first question.
Oh, please.
So I traveled to 11 countries last year, calendar year 2024, because I was on leave. And one of the places was Vietnam. And when I was in Vietnam, I visited the U.S. ambassador there. I knew from my State Department days. And the day after I was visiting him, he said, there's a congressional committee coming to visit, and they're here to study China's transshipments to Vietnam. And the Vietnamese were very upset, very stressed about this phenomenon. So you got it right that U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam went from 35 billion in 2018 to 125 billion in 2024, the time of the first Trump tariffs and the Biden tariffs. The trade deficit with Mexico went from 80 billion to 180 billion in that time period. So it increased even more than the Vietnamese trade surplus with the United States. And China's trade with both of them, as you said, boomed.
Yep.
I actually think the numbers for China's trade surplus with Vietnam are even higher than you said. So what happens if they do go after all of the economies? They have that board, right?
Yeah.
That board with all the different countries. So Vietnam, 46%.
Yeah.
And what I discovered in Vietnam was that it's not just Chinese transshipment. People think of it as China makes the products, they ship it to Vietnam, and they slap made in Vietnam on it. So it's not that simple. They sell the parts and they do the final assembly in Vietnam. So this actually is made in Vietnam, but from Chinese parts. But it's also true for third country production that used to be produced in China. Most of China's imports go to exports, usually for foreign companies. So Samsung used to make most of their phones in China. They make over 80% of their phones in Vietnam from Chinese parts, largely Chinese parts, and then they assemble them in Vietnam and send them to the United States. So what happens to this plan of China to reach out to the rest of the world with its exports if the United States starts raising high tariffs on all the transshipment points, and then negotiates with the transshipment points saying, we won't reduce your tariffs unless you reduce your trade with China? And then the second piece of that, which is related, is the Europeans, the Southeast Asians, and when I was in Thailand, they were already worried about it. That when everyone expected Trump to win, I thought. Like no one wanted to say it to me, but I got the impression that they were planning for the future.
Yep.
And they would seem to be saying, if there's a trade war between the United States and China, China's going to try to get all of its export over capacity to us.
Yeah.
And Thailand's not a poor country, so they can absorb some of the same products. So they were very worried that they were going to get hit with a tsunami of Chinese exports that normally would have gone to the United States. And the Europeans are very worried about it, especially in the car industry. So what happens when China can't find those alternative markets and the transshipment markets that they've been using to get around the U.S. tariffs get closed up by the U.S. protectionists? It's a long question.
That is a question of the day or of the year. First, Vietnamese trade last year was 260 billion.
Mhm.
And within that, China runs a trade surplus of 60 billion. So China's trade with Russia was 245 billion US dollars.
Okay, all
So
right.
it's 260 in total.
Yeah, I got it.
60
Yeah,
billion is
but
the-
but Vietnam's trade surplus with us was 125. billion.
125.
So they're very high on Trump's list.
very high. on
They're
China
number
trade.
3.
Yeah.
So it's China, Mexico, Vietnam, and China is really Mexico and Vietnam.
Right? That's
I'm convinced that Americans are not consuming fewer Chinese products today than they were before 2018. It's just that they have a different label on them.
they have a different label on them, and you're right that it's not just the Chinese completed finished
Yeah.
products that's through Vietnam is
Intermediate.
assembled in Vietnam, and also export of the Chinese parts to Vietnam. I think the head of the U.S. Chamber AmCham in Shanghai give an example that Ford could be making, well, GM, General Motors, used to make have his assembly line or his production line in China, but now it's moving it to, this was 2020 or 2021. Now it's moving it to Vietnam. But the 2,000 parts that they need to build the
Chinese
same car, they're still the Chinese parts, because the Chinese have built the foundation of that supply chain that Vietnam doesn't have the ability to be the supplier of the whole production chain, supplier of all the parts, right? So it's eventually will still have to come from China. Vietnam is also interesting because after Liberation Day, Vietnam is one of the first countries to reach out to the White House, offering zero tariff
Right.
U.S. products.
But that's not going to do much, right?
It's not going to do
Because it's
much.
like between 9 and 11% on us.
Yeah.
So they reduce that. They're not going to solve the quote unquote bilateral imbalance, which most economists don't care about. But one does.
But when
Peter Navarro.
yes, yeah. So that's a conundrum of the day. So what is China going to do about this? I see some discussions. One about overseas investment in Vietnam. So not just exporting Chinese parts to Vietnam, but actually make those parts in Vietnam.
Okay.
Export raw materials and maybe technology and maybe some of the management personnel to Vietnam to set up factories on the ground so that this will be truly made in Vietnam, right? But that's going to take quite a bit of an investment to set up. I'm also seeing creative proposals to relabel or change the label of products. And the example is this. So for Chinese, what was it? Was it the teapots? So they're going to divide it into different parts. So like the ceramic will be the raw material.
Yeah.
And the effort to put it together, it will be the labor.
Right.
So by dividing them into different categories in the customs categorization, they will be able to apply different tariffs to different parts.
The U.S. will.
Yeah, or at least the Chinese hope the U.S. will.
This will be an enormous bureaucracy.
It will be. We'll see.
Yeah, incredible. I mean,
we'll
it's
see.
ironic that the Republican administration is going to have this enormous bureaucracy, micromanaging every.
Yeah. And we're cutting federal labor force, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So this will all
yeah.
all work out. I think Europeans they're concerned. I think it also depends on what kind of products we're talking about, right?
Oh.
U.S. currently does not import Chinese EVs.
No, but Germany's worried about it.
Germany is worried about it. So that potentially will push Europe to have a more stringent, I would say, a trade restriction on the export of Chinese EV. But then, hey, well, the Chinese can export their EV to Russia. You won't believe it. 65% of the Chinese of the Russian sedan market is now Chinese cars.
Yeah.
And they have
all
EVs
this
too.
oil.
I know, right? Why do they need EVs? They have all this oil. It doesn't make sense. So anyway,
distortions are being created. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So the other thing that was a great concern was in Korea. They were very worried that the U.S. was going to have these inspectors at customs.
Yeah.
And they were going to say, this is a Kia or this is a Hyundai, but it has a Chinese battery and it has a Chinese drivetrain.
Yeah.
And the value added from China is too high. Therefore, you're going to get hit with a very high tariff.
But China currently occupies, forgot the exact percentage, 75 to 86% of the global battery market.
Yeah.
If you don't use Chinese battery, you don't use battery.
Yeah.
And
That's where we're headed.
but
The Denali.
but if you look at the current administration's policy, I think there is a push to use oil and gas, right?
Yeah, that's
Drill,
right.
drill.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where it eventually will come back to that. Let's not use EV. Let's use oil and gas.
Yeah.
More return to the tradition.
Anyway, I'm just
No,
Thank you.
thank you. That's great.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you so much for being.
Also,
people online.
Are there people online?
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I had a couple of questions that kind of build up on each other. First one is in relation to recent comments made by the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in which to C-SPAN, in which he kind of like alluded that maybe the tariffs could help China fix its structural issues on terms of consumption. And it sounded a little bit, I took Professor Christensen's class a couple of years ago. It sounded a little bit like Steve Mnuchin's during the first Trump administration or earlier Treasury secretaries that have been trying to address some of the structural issues, not by tariffs, of course, but through other mechanisms. So I was wondering what were your thoughts on that, or if Scott Bessent is just seen as a traditional China hawk. So that's my first question. And the second question is in relation to a foreign affairs article that came out recently that talked about the potential for an escalation. You mentioned earlier that China is feeling a little bit more confident about itself, yet at the same time, there's maybe a little bit of pessimism about the overall trajectory of the economy long term. Is there a potential for China to potentially escalate or be a little bit more upfront in a kind of a similar manner to post-financial crisis China in response to the trade war situation, or will they continue on the current course?
You mean China takes the initiative to escalate?
Yeah, not necessarily in the
Yeah.
economic, not necessarily in an economic realm too, maybe in other,
So diversionary warfare?
a little bit.
Oh, okay. Should I give this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
You better. I'm not going to try. I
I
could never answer his
I was
questions.
hoping. I was hoping.
I know they're a little long.
I think on the tariff helping consumption question, I think that's what Beijing's talking point has been, right? We're going to rely on domestic market. Look at how many washing machines we're going to consume by our market.
Yeah.
But being a Chinese myself, when the economy is uncertain, I know that the Chinese people's answer is not going to spend more liberally. They will save money, especially if you think about how the tariff and also the economic uncertainty has affected, I would say, the mid to higher income population in China. That all these high-tech factories, or well, they call them factories, they're really just software development companies. People are losing jobs, people are being fired, being laid off. I don't think they have the capacity to consume more or more vigorously. I was in Beijing earlier in April, and my driver, he made a comment about the government new policy that encourages people to borrow a loan from state-owned banks in order to stimulate consumption. And his comment was, why would I borrow a loan from a state-owned bank just to spend more when I'm not even sure that I can make more and I will still have a job by the end of this year? So I think there is an effort or narrative in China that, well, let's focus on domestic consumption. Let's focus on our people improving their livelihood. I just think there is practical difficulty to that proposal, and to the extent that this is a fantasy. And the Chinese potential diversionary warfare was escalation.
Not diversionary
Oh.
warfare, but escalation in another field.
Like what?
Potentially in the South China Sea or security.
So diversionary warfare.
No, but not to distract,
already a war.
not necessarily to distract from domestic stuff. Just like, the United States is looking weaker on the international stage, it's alienating more countries, and now it's our turn to solve some of these problems that we've had for a long time while the U.S. is unpopular.
Yeah, that's one issue. I think the most interesting is Taiwan, right? That you would imagine that the Chinese would reach the assessment that President Trump does not want a war. He has said that he's a president of peace. He doesn't want a war. And the question is that, does this expedite the Chinese timetable for unification? Does this create a incentive to pursue a window of opportunity? Because realistically, looking down another, I don't know, 20 to 30 years, this president potentially is going to be the least interventionist in the potential Taiwan contingency. And I think the Chinese understand that quite well. But the question, I think, for some strategists that are asking is that, well, will China use this opportunity to just get over with the unification and call it a day? I think we have to see. I haven't seen the signals of that being planned, because I think the Chinese timetable on Taiwan is still not just based on U.S. intervention. It's also based on the cost benefit analysis of the punitive measures China will have to endure as a result of that. And more importantly, and also more dauntingly, what kind of governance challenge China will be facing in Taiwan if it does take over Taiwan, and faced with 23 million people that refuse to be ruled by Beijing. I think that's a much bigger problem. So I think Beijing has its own table that is not dependent on whether U.S. will or will not intervene. Even if President Trump presents an opportunity at the current moment, if the Chinese believe that they don't have a good solution to, for example, the governance issue in Taiwan after unification, I think they would potentially kick the can down the road, which has been regarded as a worst but also best available strategy. I think that's Taiwan. South China Sea, that's something that I feel that is less discussed, because the Chinese behavior vis-a-vis the Philippines has been extremely assertive, even in last year, during the last year of the Biden administration, when you could say that, well, the U.S. China relationship was actually quite stable. It was pretty good during the last year of the Biden administration, but the Chinese were pushing the Philippines very hard in the South China Sea. And we're seeing China still pushing Philippines quite hard in the South China Sea. I think Indo-PACOM has made it clear to the Chinese that the mutual defense treaty is valid and will be applied when the Chinese action triggers a certain outcome, such as the killing of a Filipino sailor on their ship. But so far, that red line has not been violated, so we haven't seen a significant intervention from the U.S. Military. So I think that struggle is going to continue. One thing that I would note was, I don't know if you were surprised, but at the beginning of April, the Chinese launched a joint storm 2025A joint military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. And that was not surprising. But what was surprising was how quiet U.S. has been about that military exercise. There was no U.S. military sails through Taiwan Strait since the military exercise. I don't believe DOD or Indo-PACOM made any comment about that military exercise. I believe State Department did comment on it. So I would say the U.S. reaction to that particular military exercise was quite mute. And you have to wonder why. My speculation is that President Trump has not had a formal public statement about his Taiwan policy. Unlike President Biden, who came out 4 times to say that publicly, U.S. will come to Taiwan's defense if China invades. So far, we haven't seen President Trump having that position. And for key members of his cabinet, also have not observed a articulation of what U.S. will or will not do in the event of a Taiwan contingency. But that could potentially be the reason that U.S. would like to keep the options open.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. Very interesting. I was wondering, you were talking about how there could be this like bipolarization of different countries that then have no choice but to choose, are they going to go with the U.S. side or the Chinese side? Who do you see having the upper hand in those negotiations with countries?
That is a great question. We were actually debating, I was at a meeting today about U.S.-China relations, and we're debating that, are we looking at bipolarity? Are we looking at bloc politics? Are we looking at the emergence of 2 blocs? If there are 2 blocs, who is in our bloc? So that's really a soul-searching question. Who's in our bloc? But I would say that our allies and partners are still confident with their, well, I can't even say that. Just came back from Europe last week. I can't say that.
Confident?
I feel that they have not completely abandoned hope about their alliances and partnerships with the United States.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that countries are disappointed. Our allies and partners are hurt. They are confused. They are, they're feeling uncertain about their future. But I wouldn't say that they have abandoned their alliances and the partnerships with the United States, because what is the other option? That is China really going to be a better option for them to choose from? But of course, there is also another possibility, which is not bipolarization, it is multipolarization, right? Or looking at the emergence of different poles within the international system. I think people usually tend to forget that EU is a significantly sizable economy, if you think about it. And it does have the EU has great rating in terms of their sovereign rating. They have ability to borrow. They have ability to throw in a lot of funding into building up their own defense capability. Not that they will, and there's a lot of domestic debate in European countries, but EU is a significant player that so far has chosen not to assert their role. But depending on how this Ukraine crisis is going to end, I think there is a potentiality that EU will become more assertive and try to build up its own internal strength. And I don't know if you saw the public opinion poll survey from Southeast Asia produced by ICS.
No.
It's an annual public opinion survey produced by this think tank in Singapore about basically how public opinion in Southeast Asia sees everything, their politics, their security, their economy, their future, relationship with big powers. And last year, I think is the first time that the region demonstrated more confidence in China than the United States ever. And it was because of Gaza, because
that's Gaza. That's
Malaysia and Indonesia, like
preach from.
yes, so traumatized
I
by
did see that.
yes.
But
So
they don't
that
have a
was
new
this
one
year.
yet.
This year, it came out last month,
Oh.
and what you saw, the striking result from that report is, you see the region placing more emphasis on the region itself. They're voting more towards ASEAN to advocate for their position instead of putting their trust or their capital in either camp, in either US or China. They still feel that we don't want to choose. But if we're forced to choose, maybe there is another option, is for us to strengthen our weak states or smaller states coalition to act as a collective entity to counterbalance the great powers' selfish instincts. So I think that's potentially another trend that we will be looking at. The global south and entities like EU will emerge further to assert their voice. But if we come back to the bipolar narrative about great power competition, I have not seen US allies and partners completely abandon their alliance and partnerships with the United States. I would say their bet is still with the United States, to trust that US in the end will come to its senses and do the right thing. And even if that is not going to happen, it doesn't mean they're going to choose China.
And can I just follow up? Because
Sure.
you said that the developing countries have had now a record amount of World Trade Organization lawsuits filed against China. And so if, like you said, there's all this dumping that they won't be able to do in the US, where else are they going to put that? And so are they really going to be able to win over those countries if they then have all of this extra product, domestic consumption, and isn't enough to, doesn't suffice to meet that production or and then and then so I'm just thinking, then where does that go? Those other countries are gonna likely be faced with that dumping. It's like Belt and Road, where like China had so much manufacturing capabilities, and then they were able to just kind of, almost export all of that. I see that kind of being something they would probably do again, like externalize it.
Yeah, that's a really keen observation, and I think that's going to represent the key question for the future of the global South relationship with China. Which is why I said that, well, China is faced with a very difficult choice, that which one do you prioritize? Do you follow your selfish instinct and just continue to pump the rest of the world for export? or you use the opportunity to balance your economy and realize that you actually have an overcapacity problem.
Yeah.
Because the Chinese refuse to
Yeah.
acknowledge we don't have overcapacity problem. And the argument is, and they actually say this with a straight face, as long as the rest of the world can absorb our products, we don't have an overcapacity problem. And I'm like, well, do you hear yourself? That's exactly the definition of overcapacity. If your domestic market cannot absorb your production, and 70% of the cars produced in I need to double check the data, but I think the data suggests that China exports 700,000 cars as a result of what they import and what they export. So it's 700,000 cars that's being exported by China, the Chinese domestic market cannot absorb. That's overcapacity. So I think people would say that in 1997, China did the right thing. They absorbed the shock of the Asian financial crisis. But now it's up to Xi Jinping to decide that is China going to use this opportunity to tone down their capacity, their production, and try to reconcile with their trading partners, or they push it further. The Chinese already said that if any country reaches an agreement with the United States that harms the Chinese national interest, they will retaliate in
This is
kind.
going to be, this is going to be the dynamic.
That's going to be the
Vietnam's
dynamic
in
of
a
the
tough
year.
spot. Vietnam is in a tough spot.
Vietnam is in a tough spot. But hey, they have bamboo diplomacy.
Yeah.
I feel that Vietnam has been in a tough spot for
It's
centuries.
funny though, you said the U.S. allies just hope the United States comes around and does the right thing. Today is Victory Europe Day, VE Day, right? When we defeated the Nazis in Europe, the U.S. and its allies. And Winston Churchill had a very famous quotation about the United States. He says, "The United States always does the right thing after it tries everything
In
else
the end."
first."
Very well said. Very well said. Yeah, in March, I was in China for an international security conference. You could visibly see that the angle, some of the comments were very clearly aimed at peeling U.S. allies away from U.S.
Yeah.
Comments like, "Oh, I'm sorry, it seems our U.S. enemies are getting better treatment than U.S. allies." And U.S. allies are all losers in this in the policy of the new administration. So I think there is a competition or a effort made by China to actively compete for favors from these U.S. allies and partners. But by the end of the day, the trade figures do not lie, right? I think the countries in Europe are also, I think Europe runs the second largest trade deficit vis-a-vis China as a bloc.
Yeah.
So that's not going to go away.
Over here.
You talked about how you believe this is going to be a war of attrition. So my question is, I would also add perhaps it's a war of public opinion, in the sense where even if Xi Jinping or China were to, quote unquote, like win this war of attrition, if the public perceives the costs of these tariffs as too high, or they believe that the Chinese economy is suffering, as we see with less GDP growth. In the past couple of years, Xi Jinping and the CCP must pay attention to these domestic strifes and domestic opinions, while Trump has shown he does not necessarily care about domestic opinions, nor is he beholden per se to the preservation of the Republican Party. So my question for you is, in addition to this war of attrition, do you see a role of audience costs in China's and foreign policy responses, or is it more so you think economically driven?
I actually think it's neither, because, well, you probably saw that how Chinese references to the reaction to this latest round of trade war, it goes back to Chairman Mao. And what does that mean? I think it means that, well, when Chairman Mao decided to launch the Korean War, it was against all cost. The Korean War basically wiped out the Chinese GDP for the first 3 years of the new republic. But he was willing to go that far. And when you saw that foreign ministry released that video that China would never kneel down, I think that's also a pretty confident declaration on Chinese government's part that China is not going to back off. And public opinion in China is always a tricky matter, right? Well, there's no independent information source. and the VPN is illegal in China. So you have to question that, and remember, the Chinese general public, they see international affairs more as entertainment rather than issues that directly affects their. This is true. Like the Ukraine war or the Middle East is presented with more entertainment value in China. Like if the CCTV news link 7 p.m. every evening talks about international crisis or war, is usually to show Chinese people that how chaotic the rest of the world is and how peaceful and stable China is. So I feel that public opinion in China is highly subject to government manipulation because the information is controlled. You don't really have a healthy debate of different opinions. And also there is, well, also the internet management system that will screen out all the dissenting views that will be removed from the cyberspace. So especially under the current leadership, I would say this has come to a new level. Which means that I think in the United States, the public opinion is much more vocal, it's much more out there, right? If you read more liberal media, then you will draw the conclusion that everything Trump has done is disaster. But if you read Fox News, then you will have a very different opinion. So I would say that if we are looking at a public opinion war, then we're not going to win, because the Chinese government simply enjoys so much more advantage in terms of managing their public opinion and ways to suppress the public opinion and make sure the public opinion does not interfere with the social stability or with the government policy making. So I find that to be a factor. And a war of attrition, it depends on who can last longer, who has more supplies, who has more, and by supplies I mean domestic political capital. It means economic resilience, and also in a way it's the ability to shape or to manage the public opinion in your favor. What if the Chinese public opinion actually feels quite hawkish or quite inspired by Xi Jinping's China is not going to kneel, by that kind of rhetoric? It does have the impact or has the effect of stimulating nationalism, patriotism, and actually rally more public opinion support for what the government is trying to do. So I find the study of Chinese public opinion is very difficult to be quantitative. I don't trust their public opinion polls. And I think it's also very difficult to be qualitative, because the evidence can be highly biased and selective.
So you said 2028 before, along Amelia's question, the line of her question. What about 2027? What are Xi Jinping's requirements to get his fourth term? This is more about party politics than public opinion, maybe.
At this
the-
point?
Yeah, is he a lock? Like he's just set no matter what happens in the economy, no matter what happens in international relations, he's going to get a fourth term, or he's going to be there until he passes away? Or does he have to worry about things like whether the economy starts to tank?
Well, I think for the past 12 years, we have been living in the fantasy land for public opinion or domestic opposition to change Xi Jinping's calculus. Or maybe
I'm not talking about popular revolt against the government.
Yeah.
I'm talking about like, is there any chance that he will not be selected?
his
as a-
house.
Not the economy, not international relations, but only
Okay.
himself.
See, anything currently in the Chinese system will have a determining impact over his desire to have a fourth term.
Okay.
And the way, well, some would say that, oh, how about the internal, the elites? That,
Yeah.
well, we always ask the question of who Xi Jinping's political enemy, like, tell me who they are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe it's his predecessors. Well, then we saw what
Yeah,
happened to
yeah.
his predecessors. We say, okay, well, his political enemy maybe it's the military, maybe it's Zhang
Yeah.
Youxia, maybe it's people.
That's a rumor.
in the-
Sorry, it's
that's
Zhang
a
Youxia.
that's a rumor.
Yeah.
But then we also saw that Xi Jinping is purging or cleansing the PLA wrongs after
Yeah.
wrongs and after wrongs, and I don't see PLA
Yeah.
saying anything about it.
Mhm.
So I think some would say, well, if you look at some of the media, it says this is a sign of weakness. I actually think it's a sign of strength.
Yeah.
That he has such absolute authority that he can, well, I'll purge whatever I want to purge, however many wrongs that I wish.
Yeah.
And until the military reaches the goal that or the desired state that I see fit, I'm not going to let them go.
So you don't see any performance measures that could challenge his continuing role as the Secretary General? Performance.
Performance, no.
Okay.
And the last political enemy, I'll just finish this
Yeah.
out. The last political enemy of Xi, I think in the Chinese political narrative, is a bureaucracy.
The deep
Because
state.
the deep state. The bureaucracy hates reform, right? Bureaucrats hate reform. We're doing fine. Why do you want me to change? Our process has already been established. We hate reform. So when the bureaucracy was told that, no, you have to reform, you have to improve your efficiency, you have to do all these things, the bureaucracy in the Chinese context, what do? They become lazy. And like, we're going to work our 10 hours a day, but we're not going to do anything, which is why later in the Xi Jinping's articulation, being lazy in governance is actually a punishable disciplinary offense, that you're being lazy with your job. It's called 懒政, literally being lazy with your job. So I think the frustration, a lot of the frustration is that the bureaucracy is not seeing his wisdom and carrying out his policy as much as he would like them to. And I think that's also a frustration with the PRA. Told you to develop the capability to take over Taiwan.
Right.
Why are you still telling me that you can't?
Yeah.
And you may not be successful. So I think for Xi Jinping, there's definitely a lot of frustration that we have seen.
It's more over here, I think, up front, Pai Ching.
So I'm going to end the recording for those online. We can continue to have an internal discussion and have some food before the speakers have to leave at 6.
Myself,
But I just want to make sure I'm alerting all the people online. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next
I'll go
time.
for